Hello and welcome to Planet Coaster. This is the building basic series that I am starting here on the channel today, and the objective that I want to accomplish is to show you guys my thought process of how I go through and make a lot of these items here on the channel, and also hopefully assist you guys with maybe overcoming some of the learning curve here in Planet Coaster. It is a little bit of a complicated game if you want to try and start fresh, but hopefully this video and the next couple set of them will help you guys in being creative and expressing yourself and getting builds done in the way that hopefully you see in your head. So let's go ahead and start. What I want to do is take a look at the main menu to begin with, because obviously this is where you guys will all begin your journey here in Planet Coaster. So if we go into the play section and load up, say, sandbox mode here, sandbox mode is the area I spend the most time in, just because I'm kind of more interested in getting builds completed and uploaded to the workshop so the community can enjoy in their parks. But you can also take any of these tips and information into obviously the career mode or hardcore mode. So what we have are 6 different biomes in Planet Coaster to choose from. They are tropical, desert, grassland, alpine, deciduous, Arctic. Now these are all different and they offer all different tile sets for terrain and rocks. Now none of these tile sets can cross over into others. My opinion, not really the most versatile in that sense, but you guys need to take into account this limiting factor when you go in and start working on a park or start working on a build, because you want to know where it's going to fit in to the rest of the terrain. Now I'm going to bring up a little bit of a chart here, and this chart has all 6 of the wonderful biomes and their awesome textures. So the textures for the tropical, obviously there are a bunch of sand textures to choose from. Tropical is kind of obviously going to be the best for, say, your beachside resorts, grass huts, and also rainforest items, just because in my opinion I think that tile set kind of fits your kind of South America or your African jungles the best, and it's just very lush. I find the greens are very green and things like that. We have built obviously something to fit into this theme before. It's actually pretty recent. This is the temple coaster that we made not too long ago, and you can see the backdrop and everything feels roughly right for the build itself, and hopefully you guys can agree with that. Moving on to the second biome, it is the desert theme set. Obviously this one has a lot of red rock, red sand, and stone elements to work with. It does have a single grass texture to use though, because obviously there might be some plain thrown in there. We have built, a Western station here, but you can also use it for a sci-fi build, say if you want to do something Martian themed, or even Mexican themed, of course. That can fit in there nicely. So, beyond that, we have the grassland area. The grassland is a very neutral kind of color palette, in my opinion. Very earthy, kind of down to earth. The backdrop itself, very flat. Think African savanna. And it is great for, of course, your Egyptian builds as well. So this is the Osiris coaster that we have made previously. And, of course, this grass is going to be more close to the Nile instead of actually out there in the sand dunes. But I think it kind of fits the landscape the best. You're not going to put this in the alpine zone, at least not willingly. Now, the alpine, of course, is the next one. Alpine being my current favorite biome out there, just because that backdrop is so amazing with the snow-capped mountains, and to me, it just gives a good sense of awe. Now, we can build Asian themed items here. You can build Norse items, such as our Norse wooden coaster would fit this biome quite nicely. And it is very just versatile. You know, the color palette is pretty good. The only thing it's really missing is a sand texture to really use. Next, number 5. This is the deciduous biome. If I'm pronouncing that right, most likely not. To me, this is a little bit more fantasy. Very, very high in terms of your grass textures. The rock textures are also good on this one. Very kind of that neutral, good, grayish green. And it is definitely, in my opinion, a little bit more for fantasy builds or medieval builds in theme parks. So, you know, you can use, say, the Elven Temple that we have made previously in this area, and it will blend into the area, the surrounding quite nicely, I think. The final and kind of the most unique beside the desert one is the Arctic kind of biome, and this is snow, as you can see from the whiteness, and you can build ski lodges here. You can do Christmas theme very easily here. I kind of wish Arctic was kind of rolled into any of these, just because it would be nice to put snow-capped mountains on any of these areas. But hopefully you guys can make some cool stuff in this area by itself, because otherwise you're just kind of stuck using snow assets to get things done without it. So that covers all of the basic textures, and hopefully this chart, you know, helps you guys kind of decide where you want to build and work with. Anyways, from this point on, we're just gonna go ahead and hop into the game itself. I'm gonna go over some of the basic controls and things like that to assist with the building later on that we're going to most likely get into on episode 2. So here we go. Okay, so here we are in my favorite biome right now, the wonderful alpine area. And what I want to do is go ahead and show you guys how I set up my controls to start building a little bit more effectively than the base setup. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and go into the settings here, and the settings camera options. So right now my sensitivity is down all the way. This is how I can get some smooth panning shots. And if I really want to have some accurate camera movement, this is what I do. But normally, actually, I leave it on 0, perfectly in the middle, and that is what we have. So everything else is pretty much default. You know, I don't really use any of the edge scrolling or anything like that, or any of the right mouse buttons to move the camera itself. But there are 2 camera options that you need to toggle between, depending on what style you like. Now, the most default one that is loaded up every time you start up the game is the orbit camera. Now, the orbit camera is kind of a standard, almost 3D studio map editor like camera. So, you know, you hold right click, you can pan around, that's easy. If you hold middle mouse button, it's going to pan around a centralized point as a pivot. And this is just where your camera is going to rotate around. Scroll wheel is obviously a zoom, and I don't believe, yeah, there's no real pitch up and pitch down. There is a Q and E to rotate though. You can still use WSA and D to pan left and right, but there, besides just holding middle mouse button, there's no way to raise and lower the camera that I know of. I could be wrong, and if you guys know of other tips and tricks that I might be skimming over, feel free to comment, because I think that's what we should be doing as a community, is helping each other out through these tutorials. So beyond that, but the main camera setting I use is by pressing T. As soon as I load up a map, I almost always press T. And the T, think of it as just camera toggle. So that's how I remember what button it is. Camera toggle switches to the other camera mode, which is free look mode. Now, free look, WSA and D moves, but it's not a panning feature. It is a, where I am looking, I'm going to go forward and pan around that point. So it's more like an FPS kind of feel. You can hold middle mouse button and look any direction that you want, And so if you have areas that are really hard to get into, you can really kind of get down into the ground and follow things. Like there's a shadow of a bird. I believe I just saw the shadow of the bird. Anyways, to me, this is the most natural, just because I've played a lot of FPS and I prefer this kind of view set. If you hold shift, it does increase the speed of the camera if you feel like it's too slow. So there is 2 camera speeds to choose from, and it is fairly versatile, and in my opinion, definitely the best camera mode to get into those nitty-gritty details. So that's it for the camera. The camera, you know, those are your 2 options. There might be some more. Hello, birds. But other than that, we'll just go ahead and move on to some other kind of basic building systems. So the first thing you want to do is, obviously, after you picked your biome that we have here, you want to go ahead and start building. That's kind of what everyone wants to start doing, and so let's go ahead and do that now. So the building tab obviously has some custom blueprints, but we're going to skip over this because I think plopping down a blueprint is a fine start, but I think this tutorial is more aligned to people that want to actually build something themselves to start out with. There's a couple things to take note of in the build menu, and there are 2 item types in the game. There are grid items, and they are marked. They have a slight grid as a background here. There are also non-grid items, and they just have a normal white background. Now these 2 things are important to know and differentiate between, because obviously sometimes you don't want to build on the grid, and sometimes you do just to put up some walls. So what you're gonna do is, obviously what I do the most of is work off the grid to begin with. Now this grid starts out as a nice 4 meter by 4 meter grid system. You know, this is a nice 4 meter tall wall, and you get your color options over in the bottom right. You got your angle snap. To rotate, you just tap Z. It'll just rotate the block a full quarter turn, and if you hold Z, depending on what your angle snap is set to, it will rotate on those degree points, or no degree points if you just have it turned off, so you can rotate any angle. Okay, it's pretty simple like that. The add to building function basically means that if you put this onto another building and you're kind of hovering over it, it will just automatically assign it to that building grid itself. Kind of a neat feature, but sometimes cause a little bit of trouble. After that, you plop that down. You can see your grid. This grid is going to change in size based on all the points of the farthest pieces on the most bottom plane. So this, obviously, if we lower and raising the block doesn't really do anything to that grid on the ground, but lowering it does, because it is based off the lowest grid item there. And to raise these pieces, you just hold shift. Shift is the button to hold to raise and lower. Holding control is move left, right, and forward, back. It's a pretty straightforward system there. And if you also select a piece and you just feel like you want to move it instantly, pressing M will just select that to be moved wherever your cursor is now wanting to point. All right. Now, another thing with the grid, since it's on the ground, if I deselect the building and I move it, right, by pressing M and hold shift and raise it off the ground, if we go back in and edit the building, you'll see our grid now is above the ground. So, you know, again, that is locked to the lowest grid piece. If I place something below this, you can see the grid shifting down. So that is something you guys need to know, because it can get in the way just as a visual aid. Beyond that, once you start your building, you have some pretty cool grid options. You can change the grid size from 4 meter down to 2 meter grids, and this will give you some extra refining detail elements on this, and it is pretty useful for getting those awkward and small additions onto your building and without having to actually make an attachment separately. I am talking a little bit more advanced stuff here, just so you guys know what to expect later on. But for now, you can basically ignore that. The grid height is the increment on where things are going to be placed. So right now it's on 4. So every time we hold shift and move up and down, it's going to go up 4 meters. This can be addressed to 2, of course, and then all the way down to 0 to where you get the most fine movement possible. Another cool thing with these grid items are the fact that you can see it aligning to the grid automatically. There are 2 sides to each line, and this will matter later on when you're adding details. You want to show some layers. Depending on the inside, outside of this line, you're going to get some different effects, and you want to plan somewhat accordingly at that point. Other than that, some more basic controls are as follows. Control D is the copy function, and it stays copied until you hit escape. That is a pretty useful function there. Control X is another version of copy, but that's really only used for non-grid items, which we're about to get into. So non-grid items, as you can see, I can move this anywhere that I want. Unlike the wall that we've been using, you can also rotate it freely in a nice kind of left to right motion. But the nice thing about these gridless items is if you press X, and X is the advanced move tool function, and this is going to provide a whole swath of extra choices with your detailing later down the line. Learning these hotkeys, I definitely suggest doing it. It's just going to make it quicker instead of going through and pressing these buttons manually. So if you press X multiple times, it's going to go into 2 different modes. You're going to have your move mode, which is just your cardinal movements, and you can just grab these and move the item around with very fine detail precision, and it is how you can get everything laid out where you want it. If you press X again, you get the wonderful multi-axis rotation, and you get full 3D rotation with non-grid items. Now obviously grid items can only rotate in the lateral sense, so this is far more varied, and you can make your own wall pieces out of these items so that you can have angular walls, but we can cover that a little bit later when we start building. Other than that, that's kind of the basics of your building controls. You're going to be working with the grid starting out, and then you're going to be moving on to the gridless pieces to add extra detail onto here. There's a whole lot of themes to choose from. Obviously, you can filter these out depending on what you are looking for. From building materials, you're looking for building sets, property, such as like edible text. If you're looking for a sign, you might want to look for pirate items only, Western items only. This is just handy to have there if you want to try and keep a theme relatively consistent. Though, I will say, you can break that rule very easily and use many of pieces for their unintended usage. That's definitely something we'll cover later on. So what I want to do now is actually lay out and plan for the upcoming episodes on here. So what we have are a couple options, and what I do generally whenever I make a building is obviously I want to decide the overall dimensions first. That's kind of my thought process. So I'm just going to be, making a box initially, just like so, rotating this around. Now, you can see I'm using the interior grid rather than the exterior grid. I like to use the interior first because that'll allow me to add, say, extra wall elements on the exterior grid as little juts and jetties that come off the building and can keep things pretty interesting. Obviously as well, you don't really want to just make boxes. That's one of the things I try to avoid the most. There's plenty of basic building shapes that you can choose from. Mainly being like L shapes such as this. You can also do rectangular shapes. You can copy and paste, by the way, selections by drawing a grid over them. You know, just drag your mouse. You can also hold left control and just left click each piece individually, and that's going to give you some choices there. But you can see these two shapes are drastically different. And we have an L shape here, and that's going to give us a pretty interesting footprint. But let's just say this building was like this. Now, this creates an interesting asset in the sense that you now have a pathway going in between these two buildings, but that doesn't mean these are separate buildings. Eventually, the second floor could look something like this. And the way I get kind of dynamic shapes is simply stacking basic elements on top of each other and layering them out. And trial and error. A lot of it really is trial and error, and until it just kind of looks right. So, you know, at this point it is a single building, but it has kind of some unique elements in the sense that it has a path being cut through the middle of it. And that's just kind of how easy it is to work in Planet Coaster. So this is it for the first little part of the tutorial series. We're going to be covering some more foundational shapes next episode. I want to go into maybe laying out a full building kind of plan with you guys in real time, and we can talk about design decisions at that point. So if you guys enjoy this, if you have any questions for me, feel free to leave a comment down below. Leave a like if you guys want to see some more Planet Coasters such as this. Subscribe to my channel for more creative goodness, and I'll see you all in the next episode.